to anyone receiving this transmission. I am Martin Lontra du Ermiena du Melis Melis, scion of the illustrious House Melis. You can call me Martin Brock. You may know me as the ace pilot of the mobile frame Melivora, or as a leader and visionary in the principal resistance to the landowner mercenaries who have come to take our homes and birthrights from us. I have dedicated my life to freeing Bontrall from the heel of oppression and making sure that our homeland can remain a home for all the Bantrash. From the most highborn of the Bantrash nobility to the lowest peasant dreaming of a better life, I have vowed to support a return to the glory days before these foreign invaders came to cast us from our lands, and I seek your support in my cause. I am Martin Brock, I stand for a Bontrall for the Bantrash, and you are listening to Campaign Spotlight.
Hey there, Aces and Infiltrators.
In our very first episode of Season 3, we're chatting with Austin about the differences between DMing a home game and an actual play campaign.
Let's roll initiative.
This is a world similar to, but not our own. A world where cars have an even greater importance than in our world. They are both an identity and a conduit for power. Those esteemed few who can tap into a car's true potential become heroes and villains, the likes of which haven't been seen since the Trojan War. The bond between driver and vehicle for many is a holy one. Detroit, the Motor City. Once a mover and shaker in our world was a gargantuan presence in this one. But much like ours, it's most fondly remembered in the history of decades ago, and the residents who cling to its true nature as their homes. Residents like the Furies, a girl gang at the forefront of the illegal street racing scene that thrives on the rusting body of the city. Cinderella Candy Steele, the gang's de facto leader and muscle, is short, round, commanding, and loyal. A bulldog of a woman whose mob ties had her take the fall for a job gone wrong and spent years in prison, then the government's Jaghund task force in penance. Free once again, both from the shackles of prison and her family, she returns to crime in her monster truck, the Carolina Reaper, as it's the only way she knows how to move through the world. Mayday, the group's infiltrator, is in many ways the opposite of Candy. Tall, lean, impulsive, and chaotic, but just as fiercely loyal as any other member of the gang. After dropping out of her interpretive dance college due to her sister's illness, she was lost at sea until she found her place first in the fans of the racing scene, and then in the Furies. Now she's strapped some NOS to her thigh-high roller skates and makes sure that no one can predict what her street family does next. Rebecca Bolger, the newest member of the Furies and its mysterious face. Classically beautiful and verbally cunning, she brings info and gear from unexplained and often elided connections. No hard questions have been asked of her yet, as she's been as willing as the rest to put her body and her car, the sports coupe Bella, on the line for the girls. Now, a multi-billion-dollar company, Enterax, run by a man whose fans consider him a genius, has started to move in on Detroit. City council and business leaders are pleased as punch at the prospect of a new gigafactory being built in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods, but the Furies have their ears to the ground and can read between the lines. Whistleblower suicides, OSHA violations, disappearing activists, battery fires. While Enterax might have a squeaky clean image, to those who look a bit closer and don't turn away, find a company that doesn't care for its workers, customers, or neighbors, only the shareholders and its founder's ego. Proper channels haven't stopped Enterax, and respectable resistance hasn't done anything either. Lucky for Detroit, there's a group of pissed off girls willing to crash this company's plans, parties, and portfolio. And they'll do it one twisted wreck of an electric vehicle at a time.
Austin, that was phenomenal. Welcome to Campaign Spotlight.
Thanks for having me.
This sounds like such a fun campaign.
It was an absolute blast.
Tell us a little bit about your experience running tabletop games, and then we'll get into talking about this campaign.
Sure. So, like many, I started tabletop role-playing with Dungeons & Dragons when I was in grade 6. So that's like 25 years ago now. And right from the start, I've been designing tabletop role-playing games because after trying D&D for the first time at a March break camp, I had no idea where one would buy the stuff for D&D, nor did I have the money to do so. So I recreated it from memory as best I could, since I could afford the dice.
Wow.
And that was sort of the beginning of my long history of designing tabletop role-playing games, which continued through middle school, high school, university, and to now, where I'm not to toot my own horn a bit, but I'm an award-winning tabletop role-playing game designer and have been a GM for the vast majority of that. I very rarely get to play. But GMing is my art of choice. I love doing it. And I think it's probably one of my major passions in my life. In addition to that, about 10 years ago, I started doing actual play and making that available publicly because there were so many different indie games, and not just indie games, but mostly indie games that I wanted to try, but I didn't have an opportunity to do so. And so my partner, she had the idea of starting up an actual play podcast that focuses on obscure tabletop role-playing games. So we would cycle through those every few episodes. And that was You Don't Meet in an Inn, which ran from 2014 until about 2020. And we played dozens of games in that period, the rotating cast. There's over 100 episodes. I don't recall how many. And yeah, that was a really enlightening experience, both from expanding my experience with different kinds of tabletop role-playing games and their mechanics, and making me a better designer in the process, and also giving me the skills necessary to, promote those designs and what I loved and through actual play.
Yeah, I feel like there really are so many systems out there that, someone has poured blood, sweat, and tears into them. They have not been played a lot, and it is hard to find out about them, which is, why it is exciting to listen to your podcast. And, for me anyway, to actually discover new games that you were playing then. And so you GM'd quite a bit on that show, and then you also have had like long-running home campaigns, like the one from your introductory monologue.
Yeah, shortly before that podcast, there was a 1 or 2 year long campaign of Fantasy Craft that I did. Before that, there was a 1 or 2 year long game of D20 Modern. I've got a long history of home games lasting about a year or two, and some of them conclude and most of them fizzle like everyone else.
The struggle of trying to make it work with everyone's schedule. I feel like a year or two is actually a pretty impressive run to keep everything going.
Yeah, you really, in my years of experience, you need to have at least one person in the group and this applies to actual play as much as it does a home game, who has the drive and the willingness to push everyone else to show up, be the one to lead the horses to water, so to speak.
That's actually, it's interesting to hear that it's like that for actual play as well. For people at home who are used to GMing home games, how different is it to get, a party together and figure out what a schedule and what a plan would look like for an actual play compared to a home game?
I would say that scheduling it is actually not that dissimilar from scheduling a home game. You need the same kind of span of time. You need the same materials between games for the most part. The only real difference is on the production side of having mics, having pop filters, having stands, if you're playing online, webcams and Roll20 setup and OBS and all those various sorts of things. But the actual scheduling part is pretty much the same, honestly.
That makes sense. Wow, having pop shields for mics sounds like a great idea. Whoops.
Well, the good thing is that a lot of modern mics have them built in, so it's not a huge issue. I found that my pop filter is actually a relatively recent addition, in all honesty.
It does make a difference for sure. I guess that kind of makes sense. And then as well, when you're starting out running a campaign, maybe we can talk about this campaign from your introductory monologue a little bit in this context. Whether you're running a home game or running an actual play, it takes some planning and some preparation, right? And some, kind of session -1. Hey, what sort of game do we want to play? What is the mood going to be in the setting and things like that? How does that vary between, something performative and something you're doing for your friends at home?
That, again, I would say they are fairly similar. There are some other things, mainly about how the listening audience would perceive some of the stuff that there might be stuff that isn't covered by your lines and veils when you do a session 0 that would still be upsetting to the audience potentially.
Can you give an example of what that would look like?
Sure. So personally, I have absolutely no issues with describing and depicting absolutely atrocious gore in my games when it becomes, relevant. It's not
right
something I seek out, but it happens. Or an excellent example from this game that the intro is from is car accidents. That is something that some people absolutely do not want to engage with, but I would say that the majority of people don't have any kind of natural aversion to, even more so than descriptive gore.
Right.
And then of course there's the matter of swearing and how much you want your show to be able to cut loose in that sense. Are you aiming for a family-friendly audience where there's no swearing, or are you going full explicit and, letting the F-bombs fly?
And to be clear, in this show, you can swear as much as you want. We have an explicit rating, which is wild because half our episodes are like, let's talk about dice. But just because we knew that guests would swear, and we didn't want it to feel constraining in that way.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah. Also, in that campaign, were people crashing their cars? I got to ask, was that part of the way that conflict worked?
Well, there was a number of times there was vehicular combat, right? Because it's sort of the supplement that it uses, and the game, all 4 of us who are involved in that are big fans of Saints Row and the Fast and the Furious movies.
Absolutely.
And those 2 series are both the primary inspirations for the supplement that the campaign was using.
What's the supplement called? Sorry.
The supplement is called Beam Saber Rush Wars.
We will definitely link to that one in the show notes.
It's It is a supplement that turns the Forged in the Dark mech game Beam Saber into one about drivers and cars, and inspired by Saints Row and Fast and the Furious. And I wrote both of those, the supplement and Beam Saber. Beam Saber is the award-winning game that I wrote, mentioned previously.
Yes. We actually had a guest who in the season before this episode, we had a guest talk about a Beam Saber campaign.
Oh.
And
I hope they enjoyed it.
Oh, she absolutely loved it. Was evangelizing the system. I didn't realize that you had a supplement that turned it all into cars. I love Fast and Furious, and I feel like I might. And Riley, you love Fast and Furious too, yeah? I do. So I think we're gonna have to inflict this on our friends because this looks extremely fun.
Yeah, I wrote the original game, the main game, with the explicit language of avoiding the word mech at all times, and also of using the term vehicle for the thing that the player characters pilot, because I wanted to keep it open so that people didn't feel like they were constrained to using just a bipedal machine that they were in the cockpit of, that they could also be in trucks or jets or
sure,
what have you.
or like ox carts or something. I think would be fun.
Yeah, and so it wasn't a huge stretch to write a supplement that moved the setting and added a couple of additional rules to turn it into a racing game.
And this was already kind of a completed and published supplement by the time you ran this campaign?
Yeah. I had published the supplement a couple months before, I think. Before we started the campaign. And so this was, I think, possibly the first time the supplement actually got play tested.
Oh, wow. And the players kind of knew what they were getting into. Did you have a sense of what the overarching story was that you wanted to tell?
Not the overarching story, so to speak. We knew from our discussions beforehand and from the session 0 stuff that we did that we wanted it to be a campaign about a girl gang that was up against not Tesla.
You can say it. They don't sponsor the show. If we ever get that Musk sponsorship, we'll just beep out this whole segment. So
yeah, up against not Tesla, and in taking place in Detroit. So yeah, that was just about all we had that wasn't directly implied by the mechanics of vehicles being important and racing being important.
So there wasn't a shape for the campaign or kind of an end state that you had in mind when you started out?
No, I never run campaigns with an end state in mind. I always have a planned inciting incident, and then I might have, written like an arc or two ahead of where things are. But I am a fairly improvisational GM, I would say. Usually my session notes are a single page.
Wow!
And part of that is the way that Beam Saber is built, but also just I've always been a very light planner in terms of things. Like even when I've run sessions that were focused around a mystery of some kind, I'd have the clues, but I don't have anything especially firm planted because you don't know where players are going to go. You don't know what they're going to grasp onto. You don't know what they're going to miss.
Sure. And
so you got to keep those things fluid. There's that GIF clipped from Wallace and Gromit of Gromit on the train laying the railroad track directly in front of him as he races along. And it's often used as like a derogatory image for GMs railroading their players. But I think that it is actually a very healthy way to GM, because the box of tracks represents the planning that the GM has done and knows what to pull out in reaction to the situation that the game currently finds itself.
I love that analogy. Although in this case, I have to imagine that you and your players went into it being like, if this game ends with us all being senior vice presidents at Tesla, that would feel like maybe disappointing or not the kind of game. Like, I'm sure you had.
Funny you should mention that.
Go on.
I mean, this isn't an actual play, so it's not exactly spoilers, but it feels weird to jump from the intro to the very end of the campaign. But the final mission was, in a previous mission, they had stolen a literal truck full of cryptocurrency from Tesla, from not Tesla. And I'm just going to say Enterax, because
there we go, yes.
Makes me feel better.
Yes.
From Enterax. And their original plan for it was to save it for the final mission to hire effectively Blackwater to help them do something. They didn't know what at the time. But then they eventually decided on the final mission, their plan was they would set fire to the battery storage in the Gigafactory.
Wow.
While also breaking into the headquarters that were also on the campus to find incriminating evidence against the CEO, releasing those, and then combined with the with the fire, use that all to crash their stock prices, and then use the truck full of crypto to then buy a majority holding. And so Candy, the gang's leader, becomes the the chairman of the board of directors in the epilogue.
Wow. Okay, so you really didn't have an ending in mind, and the players really did build how the story was going to go.
Yeah. Because one of the things with Beam Saber, and unsurprisingly, a lot of the GM directions and play directions from Beam Saber grow out of my own personal experience and preferences. At the end of every session, you're supposed to ask the players, what did you like? What didn't you like? Why didn't you see more of? What do you want to see less of? And also ask them, so roughly speaking, what do you want to do for your next mission? Is there a specific target you have in mind? Is there a specific set piece you want to have? Is there a specific location? And the players generally have some idea of what they want to do next, even if they don't have the specifics. And so that gives the GM a skeleton to then flesh out for the next mission to come. And, as these things go, new plot points develop, NPCs get important unexpectedly, and so forth. And, Butterfly flaps its wings, and we've got a new CEO of Enterax by the end.
I love that approach, and I guess I'm curious, especially as you move more into kind of long-form role play, or long-form actual plays. Is a similar approach feasible with a more performative campaign? Can you just say, we'll figure out where it's going to end, given the reality of we have to coordinate with these players, we have to produce things, and we want things to wrap up in a certain amount of time?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Usually, so I've done 2 long-form campaigns since You Don't Meet an NN effectively concluded. One was a Fantasy Craft campaign, and the other was a Beam Saber campaign. And I approached both of those with my typical inciting incident followed by sort of loose player-directed mid game of the campaign. What I like to do is plant story seeds as part of that inciting incident, which could become a major plot point later on. So now for actual spoilers, since this is an actual play that I've released, in Beam Saber the Cenotaph, the very first mission was the players recovering the body of a saint, who the brass didn't know why the saint was in the area that they were when she died. And so they wanted to find out why she was there in the first place. So they eventually find out that she was looking for something called the Sovereignty Engine. And the players had that opportunity to pursue that further. They didn't, but NPCs within their higher ups did pursue that. And so that eventually led into an end game where there was a mission where they were investigating the control center, or a location where the control center for the Sovereignty engine was suspected to be.
Got it.
Yes, and so they eventually came across the control center, which turned out to be you could call it an ecological recovery device that could be used for as a weapon of mass destruction.
Awesome.
And they were standing in the control center for it. And so they had to decide what they were going to do with this thing, because this was a secondary control center and there was a primary one located elsewhere. So they had to decide, did they want to activate it? If they did activate it, what did they want to use it for?
Right.
And, so this thing that I punted at the very start of the campaign became the climax of the campaign months later. And, I've also had at times players who have disagreed with the player-directed format, and usually that comes up around the mid-game, which then gives me an opportunity to introduce something that will drive the plot towards an end goal, which is what happened with the other long-form actual play I did, Fantasy Craft: The Last City, which was, a bit of a meandering story about the players going around on their boat, checking out islands that were taken over by zombie-like creatures.
Ooh.
As far as they were aware, as they come from the last city. And then eventually one of the players approached me and said, this isn't really working for me. It's feeling a bit too meandering. Could we get some direction?
Right.
And so I said, sure thing. And so shortly after I was approached with that request, I gave in an apocalyptic prophecy about the last city's destruction. And so learning about that and how to prevent it became the focal point for the rest of the campaign.
So that gave them a really strong direction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that in a home game you would have handled that in a different way? Or do you think that at the mid-game, giving people an end-game hook is part of any campaign if it's performative or for, playing at home?
That's basically always been my format when doing home games as well, because I am a believer that in a serialized story, episodic sessions in the beginning are important because it helps establish the world and it helps establish the characters and who they are. So you do these episodic adventures, maybe loosely connected by a plot thread established in the inciting incident. And then once all the players and the GM have an idea of what the world is and who the characters are, then I introduce a plot thread, midway through that is foreshadowing for what the end is going to be and give the players an opportunity to pursue it. Because I believe that you can do absolutely any sort of heinous things to the players and the world so long as you let them know that it's coming beforehand so they have an opportunity to try and stop it or mitigate it.
And do you actually inflict kind of heinous outcomes on your PCs?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I don't. I never throw a a situation, combat encounter, what have you, that I know the players aren't going to be able to handle unless it's explicitly a horror game, because then there is the expectation that the players will flee from it.
Right.
You know, whereas in any other game, players are probably going to try and overcome that obstacle, even if it seems, completely insurmountable. To say nothing of the fact that such obstacles can end up being like absolute sand pits of an experience just because they take too long to get past.
Absolutely. And I think, in my experience anyway, with home games, players are willing to, they are willing to recognize, hey, this is an insurmountable situation. We probably shouldn't engage. Do you feel that in actual play, in that kind of performative setting, there's more pressure to, I'm going to use an awful word, I apologize, for the players to like participate in that fight because it would be good content? Like where
when you said you were going to use an awful word, I thought you were going to say for them to fuck around and
find out. No, that's great. They can fuck around and find out. The awful word was content. Where like if you're playing at home and you're like, okay, this is insurmountable. We are going to take a break, eat some nachos, and figure out how we're fleeing this situation. But I feel like in an actual play, there's just pressure to engage in situations that might feel like they'll end up being sand pits because you want it to do the exciting and maximal thing, right?
Yes, I think that also falls on the GM to a degree. Like doing Fantasy Craft The Last City, I learned a lot from running that campaign. I really like Fantasy Craft as a system. After that campaign, I never want to run it again. It comes out of D&D 3rd edition, so it has stat blocks and that type of GM prep.
Yes.
And in the same way, it can end up as a sandpit with the wrong type of combat encounter, or even if just the dice are not being any fun for the players that day,
Do you ever fudge the dice rolls to make the show more exciting?
Have I done that? Yes, I have for Fantasy Craft The Last City.
What was going on? Can you tell us, or do you not want to reveal?
I can't. Knowing me, It was probably that a player just had some build where they just were basically untouchable in combat, and I needed to remind them that they were mortal.
Yeah, no, I
not a killing blow or anything, right. Just a love tap, remind them that, they had skin in the game kind of thing.
I know that feeling. I've had a home game where we went all the way up to level 20, and by the end I was like, I actually need to make these bad guys harder to hit and able to do more damage because the players are just kind of waltzing through everything and it doesn't feel like there's stakes.
The thing I did really take away from The Last City was that it is not interesting to make enemies tougher. It's only interesting to make them more dangerous, because making an enemy tougher just turns them into a sandpit outside of like extremely specific circumstances. But most of the time, the players are just gonna, metaphorically stand around the enemy with baseball bats and just wail on them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And, so it's just going to eat up time. If that thing has a huge pool of health or regeneration, less so if they have a really high to hit modifier.
Yes.
But
And I think some GMs love, like, describing each blow and, being like, oh, you do a sick pro wrestling move, you swing your sword in this incredible way, and get really into just describing that blow by blow of a long, drawn-out combat. But it is hard, I think, to sustain the energy level and interest in those very long combat encounters.
Yeah, like, we had combat encounters that were, like, an hour and a half, maybe more than that sometimes. It was a live streamed game it's available on YouTube.
We'll
now,
link to it.
And also in podcast format, edited. And some of the 3-hour sessions were basically just a single combat, or majority was just a single combat most of the runtime. And I always tried to keep it interesting with, like, terrain features and interesting abilities for the enemies to have. But like I said, it ultimately came down to the fact that tougher enemies are not more interesting. They just take longer. And the only exception is if it's something really exceptional, like a boss fight. But even then, it should be something very particular.
Right.
So,
because at some point, you could just be like, if I want lots of hit points for my enemies, that we're just going to fight 1,000 goblins this week.
yeah, I think that sort of, like, sandpitting is actually what pushed me away from more. Now, this might sound weird from a person who wrote a game about war and has done multiple actual plays using that game, but less combat focused games, where it's absolutely possible to make a game that has tactical decisions for the players to make, but where the health pools are really small, so every single attack matters, and you're not just like, oh yeah, I knocked off 5% of this enemy's HP with a crit. I guess we're going to keep going.
I mean, I think you're spot on with the idea that there have to be tactical decisions, right? And that's kind of what keeps an actual play from just being extended improv roleplay. Is there has to be some amount of the little decisions I make are going to eventually add up.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely right. You want the players' decisions to feel like they have weight and importance and can change the world. And the world and changing it includes the enemy's health pool.
And in non-combat settings, I guess, what is your approach to making it feel like their actions do have an impact? I think you gave a great example from a home game, which is, financial engineering taking over a sinister corporation with a truck full of cryptocurrency. How would you go about doing something like that in an actual play setting, like giving the players' actions weight, even when it's not you've successfully stabbed the bad guy?
Something that I do for all of my GMing is that I have my session plan document, right? And so there, in my session plan document, there's, like, the setting notes, character notes, NPC notes, etc., at, like, the top of it. And then further down is where I keep my 1-page-ish notes for every single mission that goes out. And then I have an outcomes section at the bottom of those session notes, right? And so I record the notable things that happened. I don't record every single blow-by-blow hit that happens, but, like, major changes with NPCs. The players inflicted a major wound on them,
right?
Whether that's physical or their pride. Did the players, destroy a landmark or even just, like, non-landmark property? In the home game, there was a mission they did where to slander Enterax. They pretended to be eco-terrorists who only drive electric vehicles, and blew up a bunch of gas stations. So, that has consequences. The police are more interested in them.
Right,
now.
right.
Or the police are more interested in that eco-terrorist group, which actually existed before. They didn't make one up. That was actually an existing eco-terrorist group.
Wow.
And so now those eco-terrorists are pissed off at the players because they slandered their name.
Right. And so that becomes, in the campaign, did that become a long-running adversary they had to deal with?
No, that didn't. The police they actually eventually had to, things got so bad with the cops that they broke into a precinct and blew up its files room after digitally erasing their own records so that the police didn't know to look for them in the first place anymore.
It's a lot of explosions in this campaign.
Oh, yes, lots.
And are the players, I guess, either in this home game or in your actual place, to what extent are the players taking notes as well? Because, after every session, I know the feeling of you're frantically trying to write down what happened. Are the players just kind of letting it all wash over them? Or are they coming to the next session, remembering what happened 2 weeks ago?
That absolutely depends on the player.
Sure.
One of my partner,
Yes.
my most consistent player for the last 13 years, I think that's how long we've been together. She comes into every session well prepared with ideas of what she wants to do for her character and for the overarching story. And she is exceptional and an exception.
I see.
Right? Most players are just there to have the game wash over them. Absolutely fine. I don't have any problems with that. One of the things I always do at the start of every session, or whether before we go live and start no, I've done this on recording before, is I asked the players, so who remembers what happened last time? And that's to, get them thinking about the game.
Yes.
Get them thinking about what happened last time, where they are as characters, where the world is, where their party is, and where the story is. And, I fill in any little mistakes that they make, anything they forget. They are invested in the story. They want to be there. And so they try to remember. And it works out. I am a big believer in rituals for entering into a session, beginning rituals and ending rituals. And so asking the players what they remember from the previous session is one of my beginning rituals.
What are your other rituals? I love this concept.
So, beginning rituals are stuff like, everyone catching up. Maybe I don't like it when we just start the session right away, but sometimes that's a reality, especially with people's tight schedules as adults. Asking, like I said, asking what everyone remembers of what happened last time. For actual play, introducing the show, introducing myself, introducing all the other performers. That's a key part of it. And then ending rituals are things, like I mentioned earlier, asking what people liked, what they didn't like, what do they want to see more of, what do they want to see less of. You get into that ritual of saying, okay, we are now exiting the play zone.
Yes.
Time to take a deep breath and exhale and get back to your cells. It helps reduce bleed if you're doing an emotionally intensive game. And, it's a good way of building in tools that assist the GM and the players. And in actual play's case, the audience.
I was just going to ask about that because, in my home game, we don't do it at the session, I send everyone a text afterwards because of the time constraints to say, hey, what went well? What do you want more of next week? What do you want less of next week? And, when you're playing at home with your friends, that's a pretty straightforward conversation to have. When you also have some sense of what the audience liked and didn't like, for example, with a live stream, how do you go about incorporating that in?
Well, the thing is that while I have done multiple actual plays,
Yes.
I have never had one that has been big enough to have that strong of an audience interaction. I think the most audience interaction that we ever got, aside from we were lucky enough to get fan art on occasion,
Very cool.
which was very nice. But the most audience interaction we got, other than people, reaffirming generally what they like, what we do, is someone wrote in and they did not like that we had, in their minds, conflated having a foot fetish as being equivalent to pedophilia.
Oh boy.
And that was not our intent.
Of course.
That was not the intent of the scene. I would also like to note we did have content warnings when we released that episode for the stuff that was in it.
Right.
And so we took that to heart because that actually came in before our next recording session. And so, we made it clear there's nothing wrong with having a foot fetish. It's not like sexuality is weird.
Yes.
Flat out. Lots of people, I would say most people, have something that someone else they know in their life would consider very strange. And it's also funny because of that. And so, foot fetishism was not the only thing in that scene that was getting joked about in that sense.
Right.
But, we try and keep track of, like I said much earlier, what sorts of things could affect the audience, and include warnings for that. And like I've seen in other actual play fandoms, the performers get beat over the head with things that would be difficult to predict as being an issue for the audience.
Yes.
Because at a certain point you hit an audience size where someone is going to take issue with what you've done. And it's often a matter of how loud they are, right? So
that makes a lot of sense. And when you're recording on a schedule where there is some time between sessions, I guess you can recalibrate to some extent.
Yeah. It's that in itself brings its own issues. The actual play that we are hopefully wrapping up recording of in the next month or two.
Very cool.
Kala's Con, which is the pitch, the sort of mechanical pitch is that it's a mega game actual play. There's going to be 31 performers in it across 6 different play groups, and they will affect each other in ways big and small, ways narrative and mechanical. And we started the very first recording session for that happened about a year ago this month. And so, narratively, the story is about a colonialist invasion of a planet that then has effectively a nomadic anime convention crash into the last bastion of resistance. And so, aside from that bit of strangeness, it is about like I said, colonialist invasion.
Yes.
Attacking a city that is, fighting for its life. And then we started recording April of 2023, and then Israel's genocidal campaign against Palestinians started in in October, about halfway through our recording, and that, really changed how a lot of the players felt about some of the stuff that they were doing in character, I would say. I did listen to a number of the recordings, and I don't think it comes across in some sort of like apology from the performers at any time, but there are stuff that they do before October that I don't think they would have done afterwards.
That's interesting because, settler colonialism and imperialism is, a heavy real world thing that happens and continues to happen. You and I are Canadian, Riley's American. We live in settler states ourselves. When you were building that kind of narrative for an actual play, did you have any inclination to have, I guess, sensitivity readers or consultants or anyone like that involved with the planning process?
No, I didn't. Which admittedly, probably a mistake on my part. But I did try to mitigate that somewhat by having. I really tried to have a diverse cast of players and performers who would speak up when they took issue with something that was happening. And I think that it has worked out fairly well. Everyone playing. So the pitch is that all the players are working for the colonialist invading power, and they are invading another empire's territory and taking it over. But that doesn't mean that they aren't, taking over the livelihoods and lands of people who already lived there. And all of the players are aware that they are not like heroic individuals for what they're doing. A major touchstone for me in what I was laying out to the performers was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and how the U.S. military, aside from the invasion and the death toll, were also setting up, like dropping in basically prefabricated amenities from home. So you end up with these somewhat discordant images of like a prefab Burger King in downtown Baghdad, right? And that's the sort of feeling that I wanted to get across with this series and with this setting, because the nomadic anime convention that crashes into this location is a very serious thing, but it's also meant to represent the cognitive dissonance that happens as an outside culture is inserted into a place.
How do you... So when I run home games, I think sometimes we fully just have sessions where the players want to, or my players anyway, want to sit down and talk about the ethics of what their characters are doing, right? Because inevitably they're like enacting their will on the world through violence. And, I've fully have had a 3-hour session where they just roleplay sitting on a beach talking that through. And whether what they're doing is like ethical and whether they have the rights to. In an actual play, I don't know if that kind of session would be, a riveting live stream or a riveting podcast episode. How do you balance out wanting to have it be exciting and, an engaging narrative while also letting the players in character talk about these themes you're working in with the story?
So I think that depends entirely upon the players and the game being played, right? With interesting enough performers, any conversation can be interesting.
Sure.
Like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is, an example of two actors having a conversation and little else happening. And so there's that aspect to whether or not quiet scenes work for an audience in actual play. But also, there are a number of games that incorporate those sorts of quiet scenes mechanically.
Yes.
Which is actually a major reason that Beam Saber is a Forged in the Dark game, is specifically for the downtime phase. One of my sort of, I wouldn't say it's formative because it wasn't that long ago in the scheme of things, but I guess an informative experience for me was playing a home fantasy craft game where I was playing a character who was an alchemist. And because of the way that the GM ran the game, I basically never had an opportunity to actually make anything. And that was largely what my character had been built around.
Right.
So it was finding out that Blades in the Dark, and thus Forged in the Dark, had an entire system where everyone sat down and say, okay, the action is paused. What is happening with your characters and what is happening with the world? That, made me instantly fall in love with Forged in the Dark. And that's why Beam Saber emphasizes downtime. And so Kalaskan is a Beam Saber actual play. And one of the mechanics in Beam Saber is cutting loose.
Yes.
Which is where you spend a downtime session spending, quality time doing something to relieve stress with one of the other player characters. It could be, getting beers together at the bar, could be tearing a strip off of them for something they did in the last mission. It could be hashing out whether or not what we're doing is right here. There's a great many things that it could be. People relieve stress in different ways, and different situations require different kinds of stress relief. And so that gives, I know that some of the players have taken advantage of that to talk about what their characters are doing in Kalaskan and, the morality of it.
I think it's really interesting, this idea of formalizing or putting into mechanics the interactions between the player characters, because I think that's something that in a lot of home games is hard to get going, at least initially, and something that in actual play is probably one of the most entertaining parts is just having people riff in character. And so it's very cool that the system explicitly has, hey, here's how downtime works. In your experience, is that kind of the time when PCs interact with each other the most?
I would say that it's at that time, well, mostly, yes. I would say that they also interact elsewhere because of the, mechanics regarding teamwork in the game. And that applies to actual play as well. Like, if there is, players are generally speaking naturally going to try and do the most mechanically effective thing. And oftentimes that includes getting help from one of their teammates.
Right.
So making that narratively interesting as well as mechanically interesting is, I think, one of the simplest ways that a game can help encourage character interaction. Compare a game that says, all right, well, I'm going to help you, so you get +1.
Yes.
Versus a game that says, describe how you help them to give them a +1.
Which, to be fair, a a lot of that's on the GM though, right? To make the player in that first mechanic actually describe things.
Yes, you are right. I think though that mechanics describe not only what is happening mechanically, but also what the game wants to happen narratively, right? Mechanics encourage narrative. One of the easiest ways to show this is look at experience points in any game. What gives you experience points, right? And that will show you what the game expects you to do. So if you include a mechanic that requires character interaction, then you will get character interaction if they want to make use of that mechanic.
That point is really well taken. I love looking at XP as a metric for that. And old school games where XP is just gold, right? Mm-hmm. And the way that you level up is raiding more loot and sending out more hirelings. And yeah, you're right. That does really encourage a specific gameplay style that is not very much about interacting with the other PCs, if we're being honest.
Mm-hmm. I am not going to go into a whole thing about Dungeons and Dragons, but it is one of the ways that Dungeons and Dragons wargaming history remains to this day. Yes. Is that it is still, while there are other forms of XP like milestone XP, it is still primarily, in a sense, about killing things. Yes. Because that's how you get the XP. And that goes all the way back.
Right. It comes out of war games where the objective is literally to kill all the other people. Mm-hmm. Or actually, kill enough people that you win the battle or whatever. Yeah, no, that point is well taken. And, in your experience, I guess with recording KalasCon with 31 player characters?
Not 31 player characters. I'm including the GMs in that as well. And also myself I am technically performing in the role that I take in the show, but it's more of a facilitator role in a GM-less game, in a sense.
That makes sense. How do you encourage interactions between such a large cast, though?
So there is not actually any cross-group direct interactions.
I see. Okay.
That was one of the, conceits required to actually make this work. But there are, times where players take actions that affect other groups and what happens in their future. I guess this is a fairly minor spoiler for a show that isn't even the first episode out yet. There is a moment where, actually, I guess I'll say it's something different, something from the very first set of episodes. Cool. A character uses a virus, a computer virus, in a space that is like a holodeck. And it sticks around there, and they never bother trying to retrieve it. And so now that location continuously has glitches whenever any of the other groups go to it.
I see.
Yeah. So that's one example of this sort of cross-group interaction that happens.
But for the most part in this actual play, and of course in the ones that you've run that are a single group over time, there's PC interactions happening for mechanical reasons and then kind of also for freeform roleplay reasons. To your mind, is there work that needs to happen to explicitly encourage those freeform roleplay reasons beyond what is in the mechanics, or are these players interacting with themselves or interacting with each other just of their own accord?
I think that the characters absolutely will just interact with each other of their own accord, but most players need some kind of foundation for how they want to go about those interactions. Right. if you have a group where all they know about each other are their classes and species, then you're at best going to get very shallow interactions. So I like games that encourage like a certain form of backstory to be built into characters that are as easily shared between players, something that they can remember in like a bite-sized chunk and use that to build upon how their character would interact with the other one. You know, if you've got a character who, you know, sent their former squad to their deaths on a bad mission, then other characters will probably react to that. You know, like, I don't know if I can trust this person's orders, kind of thing.
Right. And you've worked that out as a group in advance with those reputations or what those ties are going to look like?
So both those reputations and those ties are actually part of Beam Saber's mechanics. Beam Saber, as part of character creation, you decide your history, your tragedy, and your opening. Your history being, what were you doing before the war stole from you? Tragedy being, you know, what happened that changed your life path and put you on your way to getting into a massive war machine. And opening is what you were doing after your tragedy, but before the game opens up. And so that, you know, helps build into every character a sense of history. Yes. And not just history, but a sense of change, a sort of personal inciting incident in the tragedy. And then every character also has beliefs about every other character in their squad that are created at character creation. And those can be anything. There's examples in the rules. Yes. But usually because everyone reads out their history, tragedy, and opening first, and along with their playbook, that the beliefs are generally informed by those four things. You know, roughly speaking, what is this person's past? What have they done in the past? And what are they capable of now? And that generally gives enough for people to form gut reactions on who these other characters are.
And does it also inform the arcs that these characters are going to go on over the course of the campaign?
Not well. Yes and no. No, because the history, tragedy, and opening are pointedly part of the past,
right.
And players decide whether or not they want to engage with it in their present. But also yes, because there is an XP trigger for engaging with those three things, you know. So players are encouraged to engage with them in some capacity, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be growth around that so much as just them leaning on their history, you know. And then bonds or beliefs are similar between characters. Right. You know, that's also a potential source of XP. If you struggle with your belief about one of the other characters and you get more beliefs, the better you know them by cutting loose with them.
Right. And, you know, I think one thing that in home games is kind of okay, that is less okay in actual plays, is your character just kind of grows as a person in multiple ways. They learn more about the world, they have friends now, they have a cool sword, and things like that. Whereas arguably in an actual play, people want the character to, you know, have kind of a novel protagonist journey almost, right? And have a little bit more, there's an arc to their character growth. How do you build in something like that?
I think that there are lots of characters that are interesting who don't change, so long as they are engaging with the possibility of changing.
Right.
So, like, you know, the the paladin who is always a strong believer in their faith, that idea is only interesting if that faith is challenged at some point. If they just don't struggle with a core tenet of who they are at any time, then that's just sort of who they are, which is okay if there are other struggles happening.
Right. Or if you're just playing at home with friends and people aren't that interested in having the paladin do anything but be the, upstanding avatar of their deity.
Absolutely. It's important for players and GMs to ask this, for them to flag what sort of narrative beats they're interested in having. Some of the times that I have ended up with conflicts in games, whether home games or actual play, has been because a player wanted to have some sort of narrative thing happened, but they didn't make it clear that they wanted to have that happen in the way that they wanted it. So it is important. It is key for, all the players to flag their desires to everyone else so that they have the opportunity to tell the story that they want.
Can you give an example from a home game of, when there was some friction in that regard?
I don't do a lot of home games. And
given you've spent the last year recording a game with 31 people in it, I can kind of imagine why.
Yeah. When you do an actual play series, it tends to eat up all the time that you would have for a home game, honestly. So yeah, from a Fancy Craft series from years ago that I played in, that I was GMing, there was a scene where some of the characters were present because of scheduling conflicts. I had the rule that if 3, players showed up, then we would have a session. And so there was there was actually only 2 players because someone dropped out at the very last second.
Oh, no.
But we played anyways, and in part because there was we did a slight bit of rotating GM, and so I had a PC in the group who I backburnered whenever I was GMing,
right.
And so we had him come in as to help fill out the group. So it was just these 3 characters who were going to basically I don't remember why they were there, but they were going there. They were going to a fancy dinner at a minor noble's court.
Sure.
And who should show up while they are visiting but the heir to the kingdom, who was basically like a known sociopath and murderer. And so they're having this whole polite dinner conversation with this guy. It eventually goes sour when he starts just killing servants to test out a new bow. It turns into a full fight, and this guy's advisor summons a monster, and the whole manor ends up burning down in the ensuing conflict. And all 3 PCs die.
Whoa!
It wasn't the first TPK I've had, but it was for that campaign.
Sure.
Fancy Craft has a cheating death mechanic, and so 2 of the characters made use of that. The third, the player decided he wanted to stay dead, and he would play the sort of protege / lieutenant of his character that had just died.
Got it.
And so we picked up in character a couple days later, as the 2 survivors, provide the bad news. And so they decide they're going to go and get their revenge on this heir. But I try to keep a fair degree of verisimilitude in my games. And so what's this cowardly psychopath going to do after like he's killed a bunch of people and in like been involved in the destruction of a noble family and their properties? Well, he's, going to go crying to daddy. And so he goes back to the home castle, and which is massively guarded.
Yes.
And so the players went and they saw this, and the player whose character died was like really disappointed that the castle was guarded and like was basically impregnable. And like, if they had made the attempt, I would have let them. I had the notes written up. It would not have been easy by any stretch, but they decided to back off. And because this was not the objective of the campaign, was not killing this guy. This was like a side quest that got added. And so afterwards, the player was like, I'm pretty upset the fact that, we didn't get revenge on this guy. And I was kind of like, well, shit happens.
Yeah.
And, this guy went to ground. That's what happened. Like, you can choose to pursue him in a future date, but that's where things stand for now.
I feel like at some point you can have verisimilitude, or you can have that kind of moral certainty that judgment is going to be meted out on the bad guy, but it's hard to have both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so he was unhappy with that decision. It wasn't like a major thing in the grand scheme of the group's cohesion or anything like that. But that's an example from, my own history.
And do you feel like, to some extent, in an actual play setting, are people more, the campaign has a goal in mind, and we don't think as much about side quests because we're playing for an external audience who knows about that goal? Or is there that similar desire to have, these side quests and these tracking down the evildoers along the way and things like that?
Well, I might be a bad actual play creator to ask about that, because as I mentioned earlier, my games tend to be very player focused until the midpoint when I foreshadow the end game. So the players tend to get to pursue those sorts of things if they want to, whether that's just in the short term or the medium term. But it does happen to a degree. I don't know if it makes necessarily for worse radio, so to speak. But it does happen. I think that once there is a strong through line towards the end point, then players do tend to get more focused on what their side or what the main quest is. But also, as a GM, not just in doing actual play, but whenever you can wrap a side quest into the main quest in some way, even if it's a small way, even if it's just like, a single NPC who witnesses what happens that feeds back into the main quest, that is, a feather in your cap. Try and tie things together when it makes sense. Don't make something contrived.
Right.
But, do what you can to make everything a cohesive world is my feeling about it.
I love that advice. Do you have any other advice, speaking of which, for GMs who have done a lot of home games and think that someday they might want to do an actual play?
Player buy-in is the number one thing that is different. Like, aside from the technical side of things, mics, software, etc., player buy-in is the main thing that is different between a home game and an actual play series. Because you are making a show.
Yes.
Right? That means that there are certain constraints, there are certain requirements, there are certain things that are allowed because it's a show. And being an actual play performer is a different skill set than being just a tabletop role-playing game player.
Yes.
And is one that develops with experience with performance. Like back when I was recording You Don't Meet in an Inn, we had a rotating cast, and some of the best players that we had were people who had extremely minimal, if any, tabletop role-playing game experience, but they had experience as performers in some capacity, whether that was, like amateur stage performance or were just the sort of class clown type. We had players who had years of tabletop role-playing game experience and were ultimately a poor fit for one reason or another, because they weren't bought into it as a performance format. So, making sure everyone understands what they are getting into and being interested in doing that is extremely important. You don't want someone trying to drop out partway through a story because the story needs to involve, a certain style of plot because it is a show and not just you and your buddies hanging out.
No, this sounds like really reasonable advice. I guess in your GMing, either for home games or for actual plays, where do you get your inspiration from? Because these are some big, heavy plots happening. You mentioned the Fast and Furious movies, and you mentioned Saints Row. What other media are you drawing from?
I mean, it depends absolutely upon like what I'm engaging with in the moment, really. Sure. There's a lot of recency bias in what I make, whether that's in tabletop role-playing game design or it's in actual play. For CalisCon, I was listening to the podcast Blowback a lot, which is a documentary series about the US's military adventurism and its effects, like broadly. So that was a major inspiration for CalisCon. What else? Gundam is a major inspiration for me, but that's not surprising,
right?
By any stretch, especially because I listened to a podcast called The Great Gundam Project, which is working through all of Gundam in production order.
Wow.
And so I've been listening and watching alongside with them for years at this point. So Gundam is really, I think there's like a section in my brain that is now just devoted to it. Pushed out my frontal lobe to some degree.
Oh no.
The Black Company is a major inspiration for me in terms of fantasy. That's a novel series from the 70s, I think it was, that I really enjoyed. I haven't read it in a long time. So I don't know if it holds up. Berserk, the manga, I'm a huge fan of. I'm a sucker for well-made grimdark stuff, ultimately. Like I have never outgrown my edgy teen phase. I've just tempered it.
I feel like Berserk is the most I'm no longer an edgy teen, but I have that aesthetic still. That's a solid recommendation there.
Yeah, well, the thing is, it absolutely understands like where the heart of good grimdark media is. Like horrific things happen, but there is good reason to keep living and to find and like healthy places to find strength. I I look to video games for set pieces, particularly SNES era video games, because I think that a lot of more modern games often have, there's the constant push for realism in graphics. And so that in turn often causes a required grounding in terms of set pieces, But you go back to things like, Contra 3, the Alien Wars, where I'm going to mention this because it's like basically my favorite video game boss of all time.
Oh, go for it, of course.
Where, and I think it's the third level of the game, it's like this heavily industrialized area, and you get to the boss room, and there's these two, like, 20-foot tall robots hanging from the ceiling in this enclosed room that you can crawl on the walls and the ceiling, and like you have full mobility in the space. And they drop down, and you're fighting them, you're trying to destroy them, and then once you do enough damage to one of them, it like gets blown in half and is like bouncing around the room just like as a crash hazard. And once you destroy both of them, there's just this pause, and then you see something break in. These three claws like push their way through the metal wall in the back of the room, and then another three claws do the same, and then it rips the whole back wall open, and there's a giant robotic skeleton leaning into the room that breathes fire, shoots lasers from its eyes, and throws timed bombs into the room.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And so like that whole game is just nothing but set pieces, and so like it's a major inspiration for me. But like all kinds of games have stuff like that. Super Metroid, Super Mario RPG, so that's where I often try and take inspiration from. The big climactic moments is often video games, and what video games do to try and make the players say holy shit.
Absolutely that. Do you have any, I guess, tools or resources you use just for planning, keeping track of things, anything like that you'd recommend to people?
Nothing like particularly exciting. Just Google Docs. Ultimately, yeah. I take a lot of notes in the pre-planning about like player interests, and that including myself in terms of player interests. Right, I think. Sometimes advice for GMs overly centers players and forgets that the GM is also there to have fun. Right. My number one trick, and this is for anything that I'm designing from the ground up, whether it's world building or game design, is I ask a question in a bullet point, and then in a sub-bullet point, I answer the question. And then in a sub-bullet point to that, I ask a question about the answer. And I keep going until I am satisfied with where the thing has been reached. And so that really helps me to drill down on what am I trying to do with this world building point, with this game design mechanic, with, this plot point, whatever. So yeah, that is sort of like my one weird trick, so to speak.
Thank you for sharing your one weird trick. Is there anything that you'd, and I think I know what the answer is going to be, is there anything you'd like to plug to the audience?
Yeah, sure thing. So as I mentioned previously, myself and 31 other people have been working on CalisCon, which is a mega game actual play series. We've been recording it for a year at this point, which is to say nothing of all the pre-production work that went into it. There's nothing that is released yet. We are hoping to release our first episode this summer. We want to make sure there's a good backlog of things prepared. You can find out more about that by Googling CalisCon. That's CALAZCON. Or
you could also look in the show notes of this episode. We will be linking to everything about CalisCon.
Thank you for that.
Of course.
We did a fundraising campaign through Indiegogo like over a year ago at this point to help pay for it. And we've got a Patreon going for that with lots of behind the scenes stuff, which is also how you get access to the CallizCon Discord is through the Patreon, which is patreon.com/CallizCon. So yeah, we will hopefully be releasing soon. Oh, it's going to be podcast and video. So it'll be on YouTube and through whatever podcatcher you get. If you go to You Don't Meet in an Inn on YouTube, the channel there, that's where it's going to be posted on YouTube. And as for the podcatcher feed, it's going to be at beamsaber.libsyn.com. So if you search for Beam Saber the Cenotaph, that should get you the podcast feed for what will eventually be CallizCon, but which is currently the unfinished and will remain unfinished podcast feed for Beam Saber the Cenotaph. Unfortunately, audio got lost partway through editing after recording, so that's sort of a dead in the water, though. It's still available on YouTube at the aforementioned YouTube channel.
We will link to all of the above in the show notes for sure. We know the pain of lost audio for sure. Before we wrap up, I'm going to ask a question completely unrelated to the rest of the interview, which is terrible practice, but I'm so curious. You mentioned that you recreated the rules for D&D from memory. How did that go?
I mean, really unbalanced, right? I don't know if I ever actually played it, but it was basically just like, I remembered the 6 stats. I remembered roughly what they were for. I remember you rolled a d20 and that there were other dice used for different weapon damages and that there were spells.
Yeah.
Which I had to come up with my own from scratch. I think I remember that there was... I don't remember if I remember that there's spell slots or if I did a spell point system. But yeah, it was probably a very bad game. I don't have it anymore. It was handwritten, of course, because I was like 11. I've handwritten a number of tabletop role-playing games that are lost to time because I, kept doing it. I didn't really have a good handle on touch typing for much of my life.
I feel like I still don't, but my handwriting is worse. So the least bad option is a bunch of giant Google Docs for everything.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear about your GMing style, about your actual plays, and I'm inspired now to go watch some Fast and Furious movies, honestly.
Well, thank you for having me on. It was an absolute blast, and I hope you watch the 5th one, my favorite, and what I think is the best of them.
Honestly, I think I agree on that.
That's all for this week.
I'm Dungeon Inspector Jake.
And I'm Production Master Riley.
If you enjoy the show, consider subscribing and leaving a review, which helps other people find Campaign Spotlight.
If you'd like to support our work, consider going to patreon.com/campaignspotlight and becoming a patron.
And if you want a hulking obsidian dreadnought war machine of your own, just sign the wizard's contract without reading it too closely.
For more on the show, including links to all our social media, visit folderfrequencies.com/campaignspotlight.